All right, welcome back to Chapter 6 and 7, the Great Depression and the New Deal. This will be Lesson 3, talking about the administration of Herbert Hoover and why he was very unpopular towards the end of his stint as president. So between 1930 and 1932, so the midpoint of Herbert Hoover's presidency, unemployment and joblessness and homelessness go up from 4 million people to 12 million people. So that number triples in that amount of time. And with this, people are losing everything, their livelihoods, they're losing their material possessions, such as the nice luxurious items that they have used and bought during the 1920s. They're also losing their houses. They might lose everything except the clothes that they have on their backs. And at this point, people become very, very desperate. Losing everything. Now they're really functioning as very base instincts, trying to find the three things that you need to survive: food, water, and shelter. So this Great Depression is going to affect many, many people, and it's going to have a very unparalleled impact upon millions of Americans' lives. And with that, a lot of people say, how can I expect to dust myself off? It's very, very difficult at this point. And so economists and historians look at the Great Depression, and we learn a lot from this time period. First of all, we look back at tariffs. Tariffs are a very good short-term policy because it's a tax on an imported good. For domestic industry to thrive, sometimes we have to manipulate competition in the marketplace. So if we raise the cost of a good that's imported from another country, then that makes the domestic product that might be similar a little cheaper in comparison. So short-term policy, not bad. We do it all the time. Long-term policy, if a tariff remains in place or we continue to add tariffs left and right or leave them in place for over a decade, other countries will lay tariffs on us. We'll be less likely to trade with them. They're less likely to trade with us, and they're less likely to trade between each other, causing global economic systems to slow down. And this is what happened on the global scale, is that global trade slowed, partially due to 1930 Hawley-Smoot tariff, which was seeking to protect farmers here in the United States, but raised tariffs again for like the third time in the 1920s into the early 1930s. These tariffs ground international trade to a halt. Okay, so Herbert Hoover, being the 31st president of the United States, oversaw the beginning of the Great Depression. In his first year in office, tail end, he sees the stock market crash and the Great Depression begin. He was liked at first, and then he was disliked. His view is that the president and the government were not supposed to help directly to the people. They're supposed to be hands off, that direct relief was not the government's job, that there are other institutions that are responsible for things like that, like churches, like organizations of charity. And he's not wrong. Direct interpretation of the Constitution, there's nowhere in there that the government becomes an institution for the welfare of the people. And this is a progressive versus very constitutionalist argument. To this day, there are still arguments as to how much the government should interfere with the life of day-to-day people. And he gets really hammered by this, Herbert Hoover does, because he won't give aid to the people directly. And the churches aren't getting donations, and your other organizations aren't getting money or food to help out those in need, because everybody's feeling the pinch. It was almost like this president that got elected didn't care anymore. He was just in the office. And so millions of people will express their hatred for President Hoover in one way or another. If you lose your home, you still have to find shelter, especially during the wintertime months. And many Americans built these makeshift ramshackle shanty towns made out of scrap lumber, made out of whatever was available. It might have 4 walls and a roof to protect you from the elements. Usually groups of people settled into open areas, parks, ballparks, vacant lots, and they created these shanty towns in large urban areas. And with this, many of them called these shanty towns Hoovervilles to portray their hatred for what the president lacked to do. And some people had automobiles. 1 in 4 Americans had automobiles in the late 1920s. And those automobiles, if you can't afford to put gas in them, are rather useless. Some people were very ingenuitive. They still had livestock and would allow horses to pull them like a rudimentary horse and buggy, and they called those Hoover mobiles. And people called newspaper blankets. People literally would cover themselves with newspaper or stuff their coats and shirts with newspaper as added insulation. They called those Hoover blankets, all portraying that they felt that the reason they had to live life this way was because of Herbert Hoover and his unwillingness to give direct relief to the people. Quick graph. You can see in August of 1929, unemployment rate was near 0%. And then by August of 1932, 3 years later, we're at 25%. Now, there is some discrepancy in this. I have seen numbers as high as 33%. And our data is going to be a little skewed because there's just not an accurate tracking. Somewhere between 25 and 33%. 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 Americans is unemployed. And you see that number drastically drop between 1932 and 1937. That is because of the New Deal. People go to work. They have a job. Not everybody. There's still, you see, there's about 11% even in July 1937 that still don't have a job. Okay. And then you see the number jump between July of 1937 and June of 1938. What happens here is many of the initial New Deal programs run out of funding, run out of purpose. You can only build so many roads. You can only terrace so much terrain. There's just nothing left for some of these programs to do. And between 1937 and 1938, you see many people go back to unemployment before the second New Deal is released. Okay. And then you see it falling. In June of 1942, it's back to zero. This is not because the New Deal pulled us out of the Great Depression. The New Deal did not. The New Deal helped immensely for average Americans to have some money to be able to afford to eat and survive. What pulled the United States out of the Great Depression was World War II. Okay, I can't underscore that enough, and I'm going to hit it again in lesson 5. The death sentence for the presidency of Herbert Hoover was the March of the Bonus Army. So the Bonus Army is World War I veterans, called the Bonus Army because Congress promised them that they could get a $1.25 bonus per day that they were deployed overseas fighting for World War I, kind of as a thank you. Problem was Congress invested a lot of this money in the stock market. When the stock market crashed, they lost all of it. The second problem is that this money was put into a maturation fund. And so from 1925 to 1945, it was supposed to mature. And obviously, it's not 1945, so that money's not available. Congress says, sorry, we don't have it. The president says, we're not going to give it to you because we don't have it in 1932. And these 17,000 veterans, 43,000 people, including their wives and children, begin to protest and become very disorderly. I don't want to say violent necessarily, although there were examples of violence. They as a group were not violent. Individuals were. And Hoover says that we have to disperse them. This shanty town, this Hooverville, was, as you can see from the picture, a few hundred yards away from the Capitol building, right out in front of the front of the White House in the National Mall. So Hoover will send in the national military under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur, and he will tell them to use our current military to evict the former military. And this use of force against our former soldiers is very distasteful for many Americans, and for many Americans, this is going to be something that they remember on Election Day. Keep in mind, this is July 29th, 1932. In November, there's going to be an election. Many Americans remember very specifically what happened to the Bonus Army and how much they disliked it. So with all this negativity, how does somebody mentally make it through the Great Depression? Many people are going to find refuge in short amounts of time where they don't have to think about how bad their life is, how they're hungry, how they're thirsty, how they don't have any shelter. So many people are going to read books like The Grapes of Wrath that was written about the 30s. You can allow your mind to drift from what's going on in your life. You can listen to the radio. There were comedies. There were soap operas. You could go to the movies, although it still costs money to go to the movies. So many Americans don't choose that path. So escaping, not literally, you can't escape the Great Depression like Dorothy did in The Wizard of Oz, but you can mentally allow yourself to have reprieve from the conditions for a short amount of time. Okay. The Dust Bowl, commonly described as a natural disaster. It's a combination of 10-year-long drought and poor decisions by farmers, not rotating crops, sapping the soil of its nutrients, and strong west winds coming out of the west to the east, eastward winds, westerly winds. They pick up this soil in large, dense clouds held together by static electricity, and these clouds will move across the Midwest. It's not one cloud that sits over the Midwest. That's not the Dust Bowl, a common misconception. It is a cloud that moves. It might be on Monday. There's a big cloud that'll move across the region, and it happens again on Thursday and on Saturday. It happens multiple times, over and over and over. You would see these clouds coming. And many farmers see this as almost a sign from God that it's time that they need to just leave. There's a whole group of people from Oklahoma that just pick up and go to California. We call them Okies. They leave Oklahoma, moving to California. A few pictures. Off in the distance, you obviously would see these things coming. Everybody would disperse. They're not very fast-moving storms, so you'd have time to get home and try to take any non-sealed windows and seal them, or put linens or towels underneath doors to keep the dust out. The picture on the top right, you can see these are kind of like snowstorms in that it's actually transporting a massive amount of dirt, and it will drop this dirt, the soil, in other locations. So you see the automobile there almost buried in dirt. Lower left-hand corner, you see a farmer. Very, very dangerous. Some of these were so dark they'd almost blot out the sun. You could become disoriented. If you had to check on your livestock as these storms passed, many farmers tied ropes around their abdomen and tied it to their farmhouse so that if they did get lost on a trip to the barn, they could follow the rope back home and not get lost out. It's very dangerous. If you get caught out there, you could inhale so much dirt that you would die of asphyxiation, where it clung to your lungs and you couldn't essentially get oxygen through that dirt. Secondly, if you did get out there and you were exposed to lots of this, it would cause what they called the brown plague, where people would have bacteria in their lungs with all this dirt. They'd be coughing up this dirt, mud, goo, plus decaying lung tissue with all the bacteria. So like I said, lower right-hand corner, people are going to pack up and they're going to leave. Quick little infographic here. This is kind of what the Dust Bowl was. If you look at the orangish area, that's the Dust Bowl. This region is the worst of the wind and dust storms. McCook, Nebraska, this would be just on the northern side of the Dust Bowl, all the way down into Texas. There were windstorms and dust storms all the way up into Canada, as you can see from the yellow, but not as severe as what we call the Dust Bowl. And then people would escape westward because the storms were blowing eastward. You didn't want to chase the storm or have the storm chase you, and so they'd pursue freedom to the west, many people moving to California along Route 66, one of the few highways at the time that would run east to west. And with that, that is the end of Lesson 3. Tomorrow, or whenever we tune back in, we will learn about FDR and his new